Hi, welcome to Blogging Hits TV. You're watching Culturally Determined, and I'm your host, Aryeh Cohen-Wade. And my guest today is Kumars Salehi. Kumars, could you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Kumars Salehi. I am a PhD student at UC Berkeley in the German department, and I'm also the co-host, a regular co-host of Delete Your Account, the sort of activism-oriented leftist podcast.
And we'll include links below the video to that podcast and your Twitter account. So we want to talk about some things in kind of the leftist liberal space today.
Mm-hmm.
And we didn't originally plan to talk about this, but it burst into the headlines, or at least the Twitter headlines, last week, which is this article that Jeet Heer wrote in the New Republic about the podcast Chapo Trap House. And this, for people who haven't heard of it yet, could you describe it? How would you describe this for people who have never heard of Chapo Trap House?
Well, it's definitely a particularly strident brand of vocal left-wing politics. I think that actually Jeet's comparison to kind of shock jock radio is not inapt.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's definitely a tonal similarity to conservative talk radio, as other observers have pointed out. But you know, they definitely try to come at political issues with a bent that's both mocking and sort of humorous and very left-wing. So in most areas, I have my personal critiques of them, but that's how I would sum up this show, is that it's a sort of a left-wing comedy podcast.
Right. And it only started last year, and it became very popular very quickly. And it's notable because they started a Patreon account, or Patreon, I'm not sure how you say that, where you get, they only release every other episode for free online, and then you need to subscribe for $5 a month to get all the episodes. And they are the most popular podcast Patreon on the site, and so they're pulling in over $70,000 a month with this podcast. So it has,
of course, and one doesn't begrudge them that. But
no,
I would encourage people to also look us up on Patreon at patreon.com/delete your account if you would like to. I'm not going to say redistribute the wealth, but just you know, kind of invest in some small businesses. Well, now that Chapo is you know, Chapo Unlimited International Co.
Does it make sense, or is it an irony that this podcast that is avowedly leftist is pulling in tons of money? Does that make sense to you?
I don't think it's an irony at all. I think it's a wonderful thing. You know, given that leftists believe that we live in capitalism, everybody that creates content, whether left, right, you know, center, has to get paid for content. And honestly, I think that the larger of a market share explicitly left-wing content producers have, the better.
Yeah, and I guess this model seems more left-friendly, the Patreon model, which for people who don't know, Patreon is kind of like Kickstarter, but it recurs either for every week, month, or based on a specific thing. So some podcasts, you have to pay $5 per episode, but they do $5 a month. This model does seem more left-friendly than the advertiser model or the, you know, sponsorship model.
Yeah, that always struck me as embarrassing. Like, it's just sort of a humiliating thing for a left-wing podcaster to have to do, to, you know, have like a partnership with some oppressive corporation like, you know, Amazon or something like that. And then, you know, be decrying them. Let's say if you're a good journalist, let's say you would be talking about labor abuses and issues of, not just here, also in Germany, for example. Amazon is getting run out of Germany for, you know, basically not conforming to the higher labor standards that they have there. Mm-hmm. And so when you're getting into bed, you know, figuratively speaking, with people that you're criticizing, it is always going to kind of invalidate you in a leftist space.
Mm-hmm. So this article that Jeet Heer wrote that set off a lot of Twitter storms was pegged to this specific, like almost a throwaway line that one of the hosts, Will Menaker, said on the podcast, and it was something to the effect of they, referring to the Democratic establishment or Democratic centrist Democrats, need to bend the knee, which is a phrase that was popularized in the George R. R. Martin Game of Thrones novels, and
right.
the context in those novels,
which liberals love, right?
Right. Well, I think everyone loves. As far as I know, it's one of those popular TV shows on right now.
There's some corners of the left where it's uncool to be a big Game of Thrones fan.
Let's note that and save it for later, because I do think that is interesting. But anyway, in the TV show or the novels, it's when the Lord of one house submits to the king. He bends the knee. So you're giving up your claims to sovereignty and bowing to someone else. So some people kind of purposely misinterpreted this to be like a sexual reference, like get on your knees and give me a blowjob. I think that was purposely misreading it and trying to start shit. But Jeet wrote this piece that was saying that this was kind of the kind of dominance politics is the term he used, that is more often seen on the right, and that Trump used very successfully to humiliate his GOP rivals and take over the party. And he was saying that leftism should not have this kind of dominance politics in it because leftists prioritize solidarity over dominance. Is that an accurate summary of his argument?
Yeah, I think it is. The idea that leftists are obligated to not view their ideological rivals as, wrong or morally deficient is a harmful one, because there are plenty of people who call themselves centrists who are really opposed to the majority of initiatives that leftists would like to see enacted on a federal level, local level, international level. And so for us, the idea that centrist people who are self-identifying liberals have had a dominance over the Democratic Party. I mean, they've basically had a monopoly on even the idea of being the left in American discourse. How hard was it just to convince people during this past primary that there's a difference between liberals and the left? Mm-hmm. And so I think that the idea that liberal domination of the entire left half of the spectrum is okay and somehow in line with norms of civility, but leftists saying, actually, your ideology is flawed and utopian, why don't you give our ideas a chance, especially since a lot of them profess to support it in private and deem it unpragmatic in public.
Mm-hmm. Do you think how would you evaluate Menaker's comment as in terms of where the Democratic Party should go? Is it time for, do you think it is time? Do you think it makes sense for the Democrats to bend the knee?
Yeah, I think it does. Compromise goes both ways. And given that the Hillary Clinton campaign could easily be interpreted as an electoral loss and a discredit to neoliberal centrist policies, I think it makes absolute sense for even centrist Democrats who have some pragmatic tendencies to adopt those left-wing platforms that actually seem to have more pull with people across the country, like single-payer healthcare. Neoliberalism was supposed to be the kind of perfect third way, and instead it lost to a game show clown. So
a deranged game show clown.
What's not to rethink?
Okay, makes sense. Part of Jeet's article was kind of a plea for civility, and that's something that the Chapo gang and the kind of culture that they either have created on Twitter or kind of they're at least the chief most prominent spokesmen for this kind of weird left Twitter culture, Like, they are very against civility. The three hosts are scathing in the way they talk about people they disagree with, including possible allies along the left of center coalition. What do you think about that? And they mock this concept by calling it the discourse. Like, we have to preserve the discourse. What are your thoughts on that kind of? I mean, they kind of like go out of their way to be assholes. What do you think about that as strategy?
I don't think it's amazing strategy personally, and I don't do that on my podcast, or at least I hope I don't. Mm-hmm. And I think that there are appropriate norms of civility, especially on the left, that they violate, and those include not using language that is ableist, like slurs that like people have a big problem with the fact that they say retard mm-hmm. on the show. The fact that, there are other words, bitch, etc. And there's even sort of, homophobic imagery, including in response to the Jeet article that was posted by Chapo host. So right. I'm not saying that they don't violate norms of civility. I personally have a problem with that, and if they ever invite me on, I would talk to them about it. But I don't think that part of what's being violated is, some sort of like truce between liberals and leftists that would successfully be able to resist Trump, were it not for leftists being unreasonable.
Mm-hmm. Okay, why don't we? Well, let's see. How should we? What point should we take? Let's do Game of Thrones real quick. So part of the kind of, as I see it, the aesthetic of a lot of the way politics is discussed on left Twitter is kind of sneering derision of the cultural markers that people who would call themselves just Democrats and probably don't think about politics a lot identify with. So it's making fun of the fact that people like Harry Potter, making fun of the fact mm-hmm. that they like Game of Thrones, that they watch The West Wing on DVD or on Netflix and like that show. And it's kind of like, we're cooler than you. Don't you realize that this is stupid and lame? And the fact that, like, you maybe shared a meme in which Hillary Clinton was called Khaleesi,
all right.
like, just discredits you as somewhat, like, makes you an object of mockery.
It's more complicated than that. And I'm not going to vouch for a particular instance in which they made that critique. But in general, the idea is that liberals actually see those stories as analogs, as sort of black and white analogs for what's going on in politics today. And it's not to say that there's nothing in important cultural texts to illuminate our current political situation, but casting it, especially in terms of like who's the good guy and who's the bad guy in a popular fantasy novel or a fantasy series, especially since, who really hates Daenerys Targaryen on Game of Thrones? Not a lot of people. She's not a lot of people's least favorite character, unless they're just being contrarian. Uh-huh. And she's considered really cool and an empowering figure. And so the idea that Hillary Clinton is analogous to that, or that, Trump is pure evil, like as pure evil relative to everything else around him as Voldemort is, vis-a-vis everybody at the fucking pub in Diagon Alley or whatever, is extremely reductive, and actually it reduces, it avoids the moral responsibility that liberals, people in the center right have for getting Trump elected through, directly and indirectly.
Okay, just to push back a little bit. You have Harry Potter and the Game of Thrones universe are different. One is explicitly written for children, but adults like it. One is explicitly for adults, and I sincerely hope no children are watching Game of Thrones because it's very explicit in terms of sexual violence and regular violence. But okay, it seems like Angela Nagel, who I hope to have as a guest on this show sometime soon, wrote a book called Kill All Normies, that's mainly about the alt-right, but it looks at the online left as well. And it kind of seems like the way the discourse happens on Twitter is kind of like just hating on normies. Like, normal people, like Harry Potter is the most popular like piece of fiction written in the past 50 years. Like, normal people love Harry Potter. So we hate normal people. So we're going to shit on Harry Potter.
I don't agree with that personally. I like a lot of things that are normal people like. So, for example, I know that some people on the left weren't open to the idea of Dunkirk, right? The movie, because it's pro-war, objectively. I saw the film and confirmed this. And also it's Christopher Nolan, who's kind of not in fashion. And I thought it was a great film, actually. And I don't agree with the ideology of it, but it was really fucking well done. And I think that there's always going to be an impulse when people are too invested in pop culture and are using it exclusively as the lens through which they, view politics, that leftists are always going to want to push back on. Like, the idea of the West Wing informing people's views of what politics should ideally be. Like, the characters on that show are very kind of idealistic, or they're cynical in a sort of lovable way. And for God's sake, the show starts out with the Martin Sheen or whatever character, the president bombing Afghanistan. Or Syria or something like that. It starts out with a military action in the Middle East, and he's in the end celebrated for showing restraint by only bombing like some facility and not leveling the fucking country. Sorry, I don't know if I'm allowed to
go for it.
Okay.
Children should not watch Game of Thrones or culturally determined. Yeah, exactly.
But anyway, he's sort of like celebrated as being a moderate. Like, there's a lot of moral appeals to the common humanity of lawmakers and just people, American people in general. There's no class in the West Wing. There's no suggestion that there are politics to the left of mainstream democratic politics that you should take seriously at all. But that's also consistent with the way that Americans view the political spectrum. So it's not like a particular fault of the West Wing. Still, and there's been writing about this as well, the fact that you have a lot of people who work in Washington who grew up sort of like with that vision of what liberal democratic politics should be, is something that I think the Chapo guys, but not exclusively them, a lot of critics and observers on the left see as a fundamental sort of attitude problem, and related actually intimately to the fantasy that civility is an inherent good, and that in all cases, especially in like key ideological splits within the party, you should prioritize being nice over seeking to establish that your way of doing things and looking at things is actually better than the other people.
Why don't we shift to this idea of cultural Marxism, and which is a term that has been kind of used incorrectly, I suppose, by people on the alt-right. And I'll just I want to read a tweet that Bill Kristol, the editor of the Weekly Standard, so he added onto a tweet that Jonah Goldberg wrote. So there was this controversy about whether attacking the Frankfurt School Marxists counted as anti-Semitic. I can't remember how this controversy started. Jonah Goldberg writes... Yeah,
some Australian dude. Okay, go.
Oh, right, yeah, the Australian guy. So Jonah Goldberg wrote, if thinking Frankfurt School Marxists had a bad influence on America is anti-Semitic, then count me as an anti-Semite. And he also misspells the word then as than, but that's Jonah Goldberg. And Bill Kristol, editor of the Weekly Standard, retweeted with the hashtag never Trump, hashtag never Frankfurt School.
That was wonderful.
And you are an academic expert on the Frankfurt School. So for people who don't know what this term means, can you kind of give just a background what is the Frankfurt School, or what was the Frankfurt School? Is it?
Yeah.
Are there people still alive who are called Frankfurt School scholars?
There are scholars of the Frankfurt School. I think there are people that you could make an argument are third or fourth generation Frankfurt School, but it really refers to a core group of German Jewish Marxist intellectuals who were active first in Weimar Germany, in pre-Nazi democratic Germany, and then were exiled when Hitler came to power because A, they were Jewish, and B, they were leftists. And so they had to get the fuck out. And they went to California. They kept their perspective, obviously, and now that they were kind of in the belly of the beast when it came to dominating global capitalism. I mean, not that Hitler wasn't trying to have a dominating global capitalism in a way, but everybody in Germany was also reacting to, Americanization, the Americanization of the world through pop culture. Now they were in Los Angeles, in Hollywood, and they conducted a series of sociological studies about also the sort of authoritarian tendencies in the United States. And so what they ended up developing was social theories that linked Marxism with psychoanalysis, so larger sort of like societal critique, as well as an analysis of how people deal with issues and life and experiences on a personal ideological level. And so some of them went back to Germany after World War II. Some of them, like Herbert Marcuse, who's the one who is primarily on the right, talked about as the progenitor of the new left and of political correctness and all of this other stuff. Other Frankfurt School thinkers like Theodor Adorno chose to go back to Germany, to West Germany, and did their own sort of Marxist theory there. And yeah, so that's the story, and the actual the actual story of the Frankfurt School and the right's interpretation of what they mean and the sort of impact that they've had are radically different.
Okay, so why, and this term cultural Marxism has been used by some of the alt-right type people as like one extra enemy that they need to defeat is cultural Marxism. And I even think, do you know, who's that guy who does these really out there political cartoons, like from the alt-right perspective, where Trump is like a bodybuilder and...
I don't know him by name.
Yeah, I can't remember his name, but in one of his recent ones, like cultural Marxism was one of like the balloons.
Is it Ben Garrison?
Yes, that's the guy.
Okay.
Trump was popping the balloon saying, political correctness, drain the swamp, and like one of them was cultural Marxism or something, some obvious thing like that. Mm-hmm. So this has been taken on as a term, as like an extra boogeyman along with political correctness and everything else. Why do you think that has happened?
Yeah, it's funny. Actually, there's a story that the leading Frankfurt School scholar Martin Jay cites in an article on the sort of right wing's interpretation of the Frankfurt School, where even Fidel Castro was at one point sort of convinced that unrest within Cuba was being fomented by the influence of these Frankfurt School Marxist kind of intellectuals. Mm-hmm. And so it's not even exclusively a sort of a right-wing fantasy, but the idea that the Frankfurt School are sort of instigators of critical left-wing thought and anti-authority period thought is a common one, and I think a misconception actually. But a lot of people will probably say that the first mainstream appearance of it in the U.S. in modern times anyway, that term cultural Marxism and the idea that the Frankfurt School was super nefarious is in the Pat Buchanan book Death of the West, mm-hmm. where he talks about this, and that's about immigration and stuff in general, but it stigmatized the Frankfurt School for promoting cultural Marxism and everything that is included under that, which includes feminism, the idea of tolerance except for intolerance, not tolerating intolerance. So anti-free speech, multiculturalism, forced integration, alternative lifestyles, all of this other stuff. The list of offenses is actually quite interesting. That you see this copied and pasted around different alt-right sites. It goes, number 1, the creation of racism offenses. 2, continual change to create confusion. 3, the teaching of sex and homosexuality to children. 4, the undermining of schools and teachers' authority. 5, huge immigration to destroy identity. Identity is a big word for them, which shows that they've sort of learned something from identity politics. 6, the promotion of excessive drinking. 7, emptying of churches. 8, an unreliable legal system with bias against victims of crime. 9, dependency on the state or state benefits. 10, control and dumbing down of the media, which ironically was what the Frankfurt School was most concerned with critiquing. And 11, encouraging the breakdown of the family. And so a lot of what the Frankfurt School did research on, fascistic tendencies within the U.S., turns out to manifest in precisely the people that have noticed something vaguely threatening about that 50, 60 years later.
Yeah, I mean, do you have any idea why it's the Frankfurt School in particular, or or cultural Marxism, why the alt-right has kind of lashed onto this in particular as opposed to something else that's actually more prevalent in the culture?
There are actually some interesting affinities. So everybody knows the kind of Marxist idea that everything in culture and society kind of sprouts from the economic base, that economics and material sort of production and exchange is what determines things at their root, and then ideas, the dominant media, what is taught in schools, everything flows from that. Well, there's a sort of I don't know whether he came up with this or whether he just liked to say it a lot, but Andrew Breitbart, the founder of Breitbart, would say that politics is downstream from culture.
Right, yeah.
And which is to say the opposite to an extent. But I think that the Frankfurt School would say that politics is actually downstream from culture, but culture is downstream from economics and economic relations, which is really just sort of downstream from rich people pissing in the river. And so they acknowledge that economic relations have a causal property, but they also see how culture and the way that people are trained to think about the world and think about themselves has an impact on what's politically possible. And to think dialectically, to use one of their buzzwords, you have to see how all of these spheres interact with each other and reinforce each other, rather than sort of in a reductive way saying, oh, you can only change, people's minds if you first reverse the property relations that currently exist, which actually seems like an impossibility given our situation today, where people require a good bit of evolution, I think, to get to a point where they're ready to accept radical upheavals and radical change in society.
So you wrote a piece that published a couple days ago in Dignative, if that's how you pronounce that.
DigiNative.
Oh, DigiNative. That makes more sense.
It's like digital native.
Got it. Yeah. Which we'll link to. Headline is, "What would the Frankfurt School think of social media?" Do you want to summarize that piece?
Yeah. So this was a sort of a paper that I wrote last year, and I did a blog post for DigiNative, just kind of condensing it. It was brought on by the question of, I think there hasn't been a lot of work done on what the Frankfurt School would think of today's media, since I think it really is true that they were so astute that that's why right-wingers can kind of vaguely sense that, that they're responsible for some of this falsely, but there's a kernel of truth there, that they were right. And so it matters what they would have thought, to me at least, about social media today and the way that structures our lives and what we think of as politically possible. So, I give a little bit of a rundown of Adorno, and I encourage people to read that. But the substance of it was about memes, and what it is about memes in particular on the internet that allow for people to integrate really kind of like extreme politics, both right and left, relative to the usual sort of U.S. spectrum, with other elements that, frankly, like, you know, kids, like teens and young people who are into culture, and especially pop culture, would identify with and would have an interest in. And so the idea that, like, the alt-right organized itself around, you know, I don't particularly find the idea that it was Tumblr and the Tumblr SJW left that created the alt-right persuasive. I kind of see it as a parallel phenomenon where people who were interested in anime and video games and shit like that were already in these spaces where particular kinds of behavior, particular outlets for aggression were not only tolerated but encouraged. And I remember that in high school. That was way before there was anything called Tumblr or an SJW, or like people even knew what identity politics was. Mm-hmm. And so for me, I try to look at both the alt-right and the sort of recent support for Bernie and the more radical Marxist politics that people, you know, young people on the internet are espousing, with a sort of Frankfurt School perspective, and to see how it is actually that people are making, you know, memes about Marxism at age 15, 16, and why young people are going far right and talking about, you know, fascist leaders and German idealist philosophers from, you know, periods of time after they turned reactionary.
Yeah, so this is kind of getting back to the Angela Nagle's theory about the rise of the alt-right. And have you read that book?
I have not. I've read reviews of it, so I can't. I'm hesitant to sort of call her out, but the discussion of her work and the excerpts from it that I've seen, that's my understanding of the debate anyway that's going on.
Yeah, it's an interesting book. I recommend people who are interested in the alt-right check it out. She doesn't quite make the argument that the alt-right is a reaction to social justice warrior. Like, she has a list of the, like, people who say they're different genders, like the type of gender where they are actually an animal or something like that. Like, she has a list of that in there, but it's not like she's saying because there are some wacky people on the left it created these wacky people on the right. She more identifies the transgressive attitude of the alt-right as originally coming from the left. And the left kind of created this idea that transgression is good, and then it was the alt-right took up that mantle. What is your... so you have an example of this guy who has a Dragon Ball Z meme, in which is it Trump's face is the main character of Dragon Ball Z, and then Bannon's face is the son. I confess I never watched Dragon Ball Z, even though I was a nerd.
Not Bannon, Barron, right?
Oh, Barron, Barron Trump. I mean, what is your explanation of how is it Gamergate? How did this, like, how do we end up in this strange sort of circumstance?
I mean, I think it's really interesting. What I talk about in the article is that I think it started with culture, and I think it starts with people. I agree to the extent that there's a transgressive impulse. I don't think that that's a left-wing thing. I don't think that's a transgressive. I don't think transgressive impulses were something that was appropriated by the right. And you can go back to Italian futurism, for example, and, you know, stuff like the Futurist Manifesto, and see the aesthetics of the alt-right today in, you know, the glorification of carnage and industrial destruction. And to me, that there's a right and a left modernism, always. And there's always multiple ways of sort of reacting to the status quo in a radical way. And so what you're going to see in the case of also reactions to the unrest created by the economic crisis is that people are going to take up more and more extreme positions in response to the failing of the center. And so, if anything, I would say that I have I think that there's a parallel sort of Marxist argument going on that the general economic unrest and the political, turmoil, uncertainty, just, discrediting of traditional American ideologies that has led to, is the primary driver of people using the internet to find out information about, in the case of our friend from this video, fascist leaders and German idealist philosophers. In the case of left-wingers, often extremely esoteric details about the history of communism and class struggle. And, to boot, memes from people who are, into that about Kylie Jenner and quotes about the family from Marx and Engels. Mm-hmm. And so that's going on. I don't think that's the solution necessarily, but I think that you're seeing radicalization both on the left and the right. And so to describe it as describe it as a wholly positive or negative phenomenon would be reductive.
Mm-hmm. One of the things you see, there's something called horseshoe theory, which is kind of like, well, maybe you can describe it better than I can. How would you describe horseshoe theory?
No, go ahead.
Well, I would describe it as like, so obviously you have the horseshoe, and then when people can move far enough down either side, left or right, they kind of approach each other once again. And there's the idea that, so people in the center kind of use this idea to insult people who are on the far left by saying like, oh, these Bernie bros, they're just, they're anti-feminist, they're handmade is maybe not the apt term, but they can just hop over to the alt-right with a couple steps because they've gone so far to the left. Is that how you would describe it?
Okay, yeah. See, it's good that you described it, because I thought horseshoe theory was the theory that people who think the left and the right are the same were kicked in the head by a horse at some point. No, I'm kidding. That's my understanding of it, is that I find it sort of a ridiculous theory. I think that you can... I think it's inherently something that centrists use to equate the wildly different priorities of the left and right wing, and to say that these are both extreme, both roughly equally undesirable. That often comes out, by the way, in the vehemence with which they fight challenges to their dominance from the left. And I think that aspect of it elides the really important linearity of the political spectrum, which is to say that there is a left and a right and a center, and people who advocate for centrist positions, in my view, advocate for essentially the average position between a left-wing position that wants, peace and egalitarianism and for people to sort of have a say in their lives, and a right-wing view that, says fuck everyone or everyone bend the knee.
Mm-hmm. So my first encounter with the alt-right was like February or March of last year, where Michael Brendan Doherty retweeted something of mine on Twitter, and I was immediately deluged with all this weird stuff that I had no idea what it meant, putting my name in parentheses, GIFs that said, kill yourself, and this is before Hillary Clinton used the term alt-right in his speech. And I had no idea what this was, and I started doing research. Later on, the thing about the parentheses became a meme, and it's a way to connote Jewish control of the media. But this world was totally alien to me at that point. So I struck up a conversation with some of the people who were trolling me to begin with. And and I had long direct message conversations with two of them. One was an out-and-out racist. So I stopped talking to him pretty quickly. But the other one was actually a pretty thoughtful guy. And I won't say his username, but it included the word fascist. And then it turned out that he was a former socialist who got angry by some stuff that he saw about how his white ethnic community in Chicago was kind of falling apart. And he actually was a failed art student. He went to art school and dropped out, and he pointed out that his life had some parallels to Hitler's, a former artist socialist becoming an avowed fascist. So this is just one anecdote. But this guy is someone who thought about politics a lot. As a young person, he embraced socialism, and then he jumped to fascism. And I think the link here is there's a type of personality that is attracted to the extremes. And Bernie Sanders was more extreme than Hillary Clinton, and she attracted a lot of people who want to upend the system. If you're on the left, you want to upend the system to create a class of society. If you're on the right, God knows, but you want to drain the swamp or make white people, give white people the position that they used to have in America 50 years ago.
There's some healthy debate on the right in which way to bring on the apocalypse.
Right, but I do think that some people on the left don't disagree with me about this, that they just think this is an insult. But I do think there is something there where it's more, most people don't think deeply about politics. But people do have, either they're naturally a risk taker, they're naturally reticent to take risks, they're attracted to extreme things. Maybe if they had no interest in politics at all, they'd be into bungee jumping.
Right.
But if you want to upend the system in 2016 and you're on the left, you voted for Bernie Sanders. If you want to upend the system and you're on the right, you voted for Donald Trump. And through a weird series of circumstances, Donald Trump won. What do you think about this?
All right, so first I will say that I think people on the left deliberately and strategically denied the existence of the Bernie to Trump switch voter, but it's obvious in hindsight that was a real thing, and there are different explanations for that. I think that the idea that they were both kind of fuck you candidates that could recognize that something was wrong is the key. Mm-hmm. That what makes centrism particularly untenable in times of crisis and instability is the idea that actually everything is okay. America is already great was the slogan of the Hillary Clinton campaign.
Yeah, she sold hats that said America's already great as a comeback to Trump's Make America Great Again hats.
Yeah, and sort of like vociferously defending an unsatisfactory status quo is never, I think, going to win out when people are unsatisfied with the status quo. And so, it's understandable that someone might go to another ideology that at least understands that things are fucked and have to change, versus an ideology that just says, the sky is red. And the left response should be, make America great for the first time, please.
Mm-hmm. John Kerry's had in 2004. He had a slogan, "Make America America Again." Do you remember
that? You know what? I don't remember it, and I always assumed that it was a joke. That was like a Daily Show kind of like Colbert thing.
No, it was based off of a oh god, his name is slipping my mind. It was based off of a poem, and I believe that even John Kerry wrote the introduction to a Langston Hughes poem, I think.
Okay.
John Kerry wrote the introduction to a reissued edition of this poem that contained the line "Make America America Again," that was released as a campaign, a piece of paraphernalia in the 2004 campaign. But maybe I'm just misremembering this. But both sides have this appeal to the vanished past or the I don't know. Does the left? Maybe they don't.
This is a very important and topical question, actually. I think that the left has some critiques of the status quo of neoliberalism that refer to previous social democratic tendencies, like the post-war welfare state that was built up. Also, what FDR did in the 30s, establishing Social Security, unemployment. And especially in Europe, obviously, you saw countries like Germany, countries like Sweden, Britain, they built up pretty robust welfare states, even under conservative governments. And the idea that a society can consider healthcare a universal right and think that the government should have a responsibility to provide healthcare, at least in cases where people can't afford it, and at most for everyone just equally, is an attractive idea. And to show that that's compatible with capitalism actually is a strong. I think it's a strong rhetorical point for reformist impulses now, and it's a way of saying that things could also be otherwise. That there was a time when people thought that the market, didn't dictate everything, and that, that these sorts of attitudes can change. It's not that Americans love their choice, and so that's why they're against Obamacare. Maybe they're against it because it was a shitty bill, and they would like a more reliable, universal, piece of legislation that actually covers everybody. Now, Obamacare is much more popular because people are trying to take it away, but single payer is even more popular.
Let's close talking about neoliberalism. So I had 15 minutes of fame or infamy on Twitter because the journalist Eve Paiser, who's a great writer and a great Twitter user, put out a call for people who self-identified as neoliberals, who are the punching bags of left Twitter, to write in and for an article. So I replied, "I'm a neoliberal sellout, ask me anything," and ended up in the article. If I had thought about it a little bit more, I probably would have spent more than 5 minutes writing that up. But it was quoted in the article, which we'll link to. Apparently, roughly 80 other young men and 2 women responded to her request for self-identified neoliberals, and then Will Menaker, the previously mentioned Chapo Trap House host, tagged me, and so I got some grief from the lefties on Twitter, but it was all in good fun. But I did come out as a neoliberal.
The tweet for people that
we'll link to the tweet. It included a quote from me, in which I said, Trumpism, something to the effect of Trumpism is a 5-alarm fire. The left and the center left need to unite to fight against it, and if Trump doesn't do it, nothing ever will. And I also included a insult to Chapo Trap House ism, which is what got Will's attention, I suppose. So, yeah, I'm not a political expert, but it does make sense to term my beliefs neoliberal as I understand the term. I sent this article to my mom, and she said, I don't really know what a neoliberal is, so I'm going to read this article. So normal people don't really know what this term means, and Jonathan Chait wrote a piece about how the term is being misused. But
this is all very recent, right? Like, a year ago, people hadn't heard it as much, and a year before that, people had heard it even less. And so I think that people recognize that it has some significance, and it will probably become more of a household term. That's just my personal prediction.
Well, I guess my question for you would be, and like I said, I'm a neoliberal, ask me anything. But my question for you would be, do you think that neoliberals are the enemy that needs to be vanquished by the left before attacking conservatism? Or can we unite against conservatism and then have our battle over what the left stands for?
I think that's the wrong impulse, to simply unite to fight conservatism, because the question is who dictates the terms of unity, right? And that's what the bend the knee quote is about, is that the Democratic Party and liberals have for decades said, you bend the knee, you barely have a place in the party. So if you want, go start your own irrelevant party. Haha, turns out there are rules that make it nearly impossible. And that's a basic question of who's at the wheel. Bernie is the most popular politician in America. That should tell you something. Elizabeth Warren is the second most popular, but not quite as popular as Bernie, because she's a little bit more tied to the Democratic establishment. I think people like a politician who is critical also of the Democrats, and the Democrats should heed that. I think in the case of people like Chapo, people like just people on Twitter, it's a two-front war. They fight it. I don't have any critiques of them on that level. I think at least 50% of the critiques that they have are against conservatives. But given that the neoliberal center is the dominant contingent in the Democratic Party, which we are all being asked not so politely to get in line with or get the fuck out, it makes sense to show how neoliberal centrism has been discredited, especially through the 2016 election. But you can also make the case that Obama's presidency and its failings are specifically linked to the critiques that people have of Hillary Clinton and of neoliberalism. Like 1,000 state house and state senate seats were lost under his presidency, despite the fact that people in our circles love the fuck out of him. Maybe not my circles, but he
remains a broadly popular figure. If you call yourself broadly popular, yeah, if you call yourself progressive or liberal, you probably still really like Barack Obama. Actually, here's something I want to ask you. Lib is a term of derision on the left. How do people on the left view the term progressive? Is it just a synonym or refers more to social issues?
Lib is, first of all, also a term of derision on the right. I don't hear it so much from the left, precisely because I think people on the left are sensitive about phrasing things in exactly the same way as conservatives do. So just, maybe they'll say lib. Maybe that's evidence that there's some talk show sort of like lingo going on. But I think that in general, lib just means liberal. It means someone who, when it comes down to it, is not fundamentally opposed to capitalism, is not fundamentally opposed to politicians that are, pro, intervention in the Middle East, that are, basically being anti-imperialist is something that distinguishes the left and liberals from a left perspective. And I think, frankly, the onus is on liberals to disprove that, given who is in Congress and what sort of policies they virtually all support. I think there's a question of how you interpret failure, too. Like, reaction to right-wing victories is important. It defines, in a lot of ways, how we are approaching the current party split. I think that the contradictions are sort of polarizing, and when they're revealed, like in the economic crisis or in a little snap district congressional election, people can see that the center is untenable because it's precisely the center that's kind of unmoored from strong politics. I think when you campaign as a diet Republican, there's really not a lot of mystery as to why people who like Republicans would choose a Republican. And, I think the left is going to come out of an electoral failure, like especially 2016, saying we should have been more left-wing. And it really boggles the mind that there are leftists liberals that came out of 2016 thinking that the Democrats should be more conservative, or that the mandate of the Democrats after that walloping was not to move left.
Well, I wouldn't agree with that, but I think it's not a crazy thing to think. I mean, the election was so close that anything could have changed it. But if, certainly if Barack Obama had run again, he would have won. I think if pretty much any other Democrat who had a chance had run, Joe Biden had run, Bernie Sanders had run, Bernie would have won, Joe would have won. I just think Clinton was a uniquely flawed candidate.
Yeah.
And ran a really...
So what does it say about all of these people in power in the media that were somehow under the impression that she was a decidedly better candidate than Bernie Sanders and would be, despite everything going on that we knew about beforehand, still had a better chance of beating Trump, despite even polls that showed that wasn't true, that Sanders had a better shot in national polls, and even in a great deal of the swing states that ended up being important over Hillary.
Well, and she was the she was the establishment candidate, and the establishment.
So what does that say about the establishment that they let that happen?
It was a failure. I mean, in my opinion, it was a failure by everyone involved. Like, all our sinners, all are being punished right now. I think if Bernie hadn't run, Clinton would have won in 2016 because there were people who became very unhappy with her because of the race Bernie ran. I think if she had better email retention policies, she wouldn't have lost. It was so close and so bizarre that I think basically any change would have altered the outcome.
So that's an empirical question of there are a lot of factors, so theoretically any one little thing could have tipped it. But why do we allow it to be that fucking close, right? Like, if your politics mean that, a few thousand vote swing can usher in fascism, then you need stronger, more robust politics than that. Like, I don't think it's true that it was Bernie Sanders' sort of like campaign as such that made people aware of these weaknesses. Clearly, these were, especially the stuff about her being corrupt and crony capitalism and stuff that the right used against her. Mm-hmm. That wasn't contingent on Bernie at all. Like, a lot of the populist sentiment against Hillary on the right has very little to do with the actual specifics of, like, Bernie critiqued her as being not a real Democrat, as being unfair to people, as being conciliatory where she should have been combative, being imperialist where she should have been, I guess, according to Bernie, a little less imperialist. And she lost to Obama too, right? Like, he already had exposed a lot more of the stuff that was damaging to her than Bernie did. He ran a more aggressive campaign, a lot of people say. Is the fact that Hillary lost Obama's fault?
I think, well, in my schema of everyone deserves a share of the blame, part of it is Obama's fault. He should have never appointed her Secretary of State. He should have never read Team of Rivals. If he hadn't appointed her Secretary of State, she would have been in a much weaker position because she wouldn't have had really a foreign policy record beyond voting for the Iraq War. So he helped burnish her credentials and made her his natural successor. If Joe Biden's son hadn't died of brain cancer, then Trump wouldn't have won. There's just if Bill Clinton had never received a blowjob in the Oval Office, Trump wouldn't have won. I joked on Twitter a couple weeks ago that the Peloponnesian War was a kind of early version of the Clinton versus Bernie 2016 election, because Twitter seems to want to relitigate the Democratic primary over and over and over again. So we probably shouldn't continue to do that here. But
it seems like both sides think that the onus is on the other side to bend the knee, as it were. And I think the left is just being very insistent that is not the case now, that's not going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, do you think, I should know for the record, I voted for Bernie in the primary because they wouldn't let me write in a candidate. My preferred candidate was Bill Bradley, but they wouldn't let me write him in, or at least the old man who was running the polls in my Rochester suburb in New York State said it was not possible to write in a candidate, but I did vote for Bernie in the primary. Do you think, maybe we'll close on this, what do you think is the best strategy to oppose Trump right now?
I happen to think that organizing on specific issues, especially in response to stuff like healthcare, like actively pressing issues that have some traction also with people at large, is going to be an important strategy. I think that people who are doing advocacy both against Obamacare repeal and for single payer have exactly the right idea. And if Democrats pay attention to that, they'll campaign on single payer, as people like Kirsten Gillibrand, who's a Blue Dog Democrat, by affiliation, have actually endorsed already. Like the idea that harping on the Russia issue is going to be a viable electoral strategy for 2018 or, my God, 2020 is beyond ludicrous to me. Like, I am all for pursuing that, investigation as far as the law, dictates, but it's not a campaign strategy. It's definitely not a point that people care about, especially as they're actively losing health insurance. So giving people an alternative that makes sense, that makes more sense than Obamacare, especially when you explain it to them. I think that's part of the problem, is that Obamacare was very difficult. It was very difficult to explain why someone who wanted to give everyone health care would come up with a plan like Obamacare. And with single payer health care, there are plans and there are models out there for how it would be done. John Conyers has introduced a bill to that effect regularly. Now it's really gaining traction when, roughly 24 million people still, don't have health care. And similar numbers would be left off by the Obamacare repeal. I think that there's a lot of room for Democrats to piggyback in a way off of the important organizing work, and hopefully to actually collaborate with and not just co-opt the important organizing work that's being done around healthcare, and to advance that, because right wingers are really afraid of it. And I watch a little bit of Fox News. I dabble in a little bit of Fox News watching, and they are scared shitless. Every discussion includes a little warning about, if we fuck this up. It's never clear what they mean. Like, if it succeeds, it'll lead to single payer, or if it fails, it seems like both is their anxiety. And so we have a real opportunity here because it makes sense to people. It's I think the number one issue that people on the left and the populace at large cares about passionately, and it's a really important front. There are other fronts, but we can get into that maybe at a later date.
I agree with you in half. What I think the Russia stuff does do, I think people on the left were kind of mocking the Russia investigation early on. As more has come out, I've heard less of that, because it seems like maybe there is something there, crazy as it seems. Certainly Trump, I think the reason to continue to pursue it is that it drives Trump crazy, and it occupies a lot of the whatever, there's only so much bandwidth that the White House has at any time. And when it's filled up with the Russia investigation, it means they can't spend time doing other shitty things. So even if there's nothing there, it's worth just grinding up, hours and days of the Trump administration's time dealing with this. But maybe there is something there. They're certainly acting as though they're not acting like innocent people. They're acting like guilty people. So I would say, and normal people do care about this, even though it doesn't materially affect them, I think, because it gives them a villain to fight against, and it just seems fucked up and crazy. But I do agree that single payer should be a policy goal that the Democrats should work for.
But I think the irony of the Russia hysteria is that the villain in the Russia hysteria is not Trump, it's Putin. And so it's a ridiculous way to fight Russia. A Freudian slip. It's a ridiculous way to fight Trump, because you're basically asking people to accept that the most important flaw in Trump, the most egregious thing that he's done, that is the most worthy of our outrage, is that he is corrupt and has been influenced by foreign leaders. And the more you get into Trump is literally a puppet of Putin, like people like Joyanne Reid on MSNBC,
she's the worst.
The more you get into, literally, that's my InfoWars of the left. That's what I think is fucking, outrageous. And once you get into that territory where you're literally just denying all of these horrible, powerful people their agency, I think you're in fantasy land. And people aren't going to care about it. People have, been watching their president be corrupt on every imaginable television show. On the most conservative shows imaginable, everybody, including the president, can be corrupted. And I don't think that has ever sunk Trump before.
He is a unique figure in terms of world history, I think. We're probably running up against the end of our time. Maybe we continue this conversation another time.
I would love that.
Where can people find your work if they're interested in learning more about it?
You can definitely feel free to listen to my podcast every week. We're at deleteyouraccount.libsyn.com. And you can look me up on Twitter. I'm at Kumars Salehi, Kumars Salehi. you should also look us up on, iTunes. You can subscribe on iTunes and, get it on your iPhone and phone or whatever, Stitcher Radio. We were a weekly podcast, and the regular host might even be returning soon. So that'll be exciting.
Cool. And for people who don't know, you can also subscribe to this particular podcast, Culturally Determined, in iTunes. And if you like the show, you can leave us a rating, which it helps in terms of the iTunes algorithm for people to discover the podcast who don't already subscribe to it. So, Kumars, thanks so much for coming on. Thanks to our listeners and viewers, and we'll see you again next time.
Oh, sweet.